For the first time in history, the Supreme Court of Canada is far more diverse than at any other time in its 150-year history. Currently, the majority of the judges are women, including one Indigenous woman.
Do hereby constitute and appoint you, Michelle Obonsawin, a puisné judge of the Supreme Court of Canada.
I joined a dynamic court where great jurists like Justice Bertha Wilson, Justice Claire L'Heureux-Dubé, Justice Beverly McLaughlin, and Justice Rosalie Abella have sat. These women inspired me to want to sit on the highest court of our land.
In 2021, Mahmoud Jamal became the first person of color and member of a religious minority to be sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court.
A belief in the inherent value of the diversity of nationalities, ethnicities, religions, languages, legal systems, and perspectives that exemplify what it means to be Canadian.
The first change to the all-white male Supreme Court came nearly 40 years before, in 1982. Bertha Wilson was sworn in as the first female judge on the Supreme Court of Canada. She had immigrated to Canada in 1949 after graduating from university in her native Scotland. Kent Roach served as a law clerk to Justice Wilson.
I had the privilege of working for her for about 11 months. I'd like to think I would have taken a bullet for her, but I think at the end she shook my hand and gave me a box of Scottish shortbread. That was my going away gift. So I always thought that, yes, it obviously matters that women are on the court.
Yet Bertha Wilson faced a lot of resistance when named to the Supreme Court. Author and distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa, Constance Backhouse.
When Bertha Wilson took a seat on the Supreme Court of Canada, many people challenged it and said she was just not fit, not a good appointee. And I think there was an awkwardness around her. Her fellow judges really weren't quite sure how to treat her. There was a sense of discomfort. A change had come over this all-male institution where they used to sit around and drink brandy at the end of a day and, tell off-color jokes and talk about sports. And Bertha Wilson was interested in ballet and music. She was just not in their same circle. And I think that, they felt it was an intrusion.
Wilson's appointment did make a difference for women arguing before the court.
I think certainly when Bertha Wilson went on the Supreme Court, a lot of the feminist lawyers said we can make different arguments. We couldn't make them before an all-male bench of judges. They wouldn't understand. We'd have had to go back to A, B, C. But with Bertha Wilson there, we can jump to D right away and say, here's the problem, and here's what we think the solution is. So it makes a difference to have representatives.
A few years after Wilson's appointment, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney named Claire L'Heureux-Dubé as the second woman to the Supreme Court. Dubé also struggled with some of her male colleagues on the court. Alberta Judge John Wesley McClung wrote an open letter in the National Post following one decision on the court where he personally attacked Justice Dubé. After much outrage, McClung apologized.
Of course, Justice Wilson, I'm not sure if this happened, but famously when Justice McLaughlin was being sworn in as the third woman on the court, which also happened while I was a clerk, leaned over to Justice L'Heureux-Dubé and said 3 down, 6 to go. So it obviously makes a difference.
Beverly McLaughlin first joined the Supreme Court in 1989 and went on to serve as Chief Justice from 2000 to 2017.
So often there was this old myth when I first got on the courts that, or even in the profession of law, women were being given these positions simply because they were women, and that's such a flawed idea.
Every judgment by the Supreme Court has been rendered in both official languages since 1970.
individuals, Canadians, and certainly members of Parliament can involve themselves in the process for the appointment of the next Supreme Court justice.
In 2016, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a new process to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. The process included a requirement that all future judges be functionally bilingual. Robert Schertzer is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and author of The Judicial Role in a Diverse Federation.
Yes.
He says Trudeau's process to appoint judges to the High Court encountered a few problems.
The first reality is that Canada is a very large country with significant regional diversity, and so that this convention of regional representation on the bench constrains one's ability to reflect the diversity of Canada, and particularly to find bilingual justices as well. And that tension, right, of ensuring that you have representation on the bench also runs up against its purpose in our system, which is to be independent.
Yet, some court watchers say diversity does include regional diversity.
Geography makes a difference, right? And I mean, as I said, 3 of the judges have to be from Quebec. 1 by convention is from the East, 3 by convention from Ontario, 1 from BC, and then the prairie provinces fight over another. And so, you know, and certainly when you clerk there, one of the great privileges is meeting young lawyers from all over Canada. So yes, I mean, identity, gender, race, ethnicity, all makes a difference.
We're going to be reviewing the appointment process for Supreme Court justices.
The new process Trudeau established also included an independent advisory board. Former Prime Minister Kim Campbell chaired the board in 2016, 2017, and 2019.
It's interesting that when you have an institution and you think it's working well and it seems fine for you, you don't see the way in which it may perpetuate a certain way of looking at the law or looking at society or judging things. And once the charter came in, where issues arose that really affected the way people lived and personal rights, it became more important to ensure that the Supreme Court of Canada could reflect the voices of Canadians and the reality of lives that Canadians lived. So I think what we see now is a much more diverse court, which I'm sure, you know, creates much more lively and interesting discussions among the justices.
When I would be asked by prime ministers about potential appointments, I would say, well, look first of all to see whether the person is a really good jurist, and then of course other considerations such as regional considerations which play a role in Canada, and diversity and so on can play a role.
Carrie Frock is a law professor with a focus on equality, social and economic rights, and access to justice. She believes diversity on the Supreme Court is also about judges having different experiences upon which they can draw.
I can look at the different Supreme Court decisions and know a little bit about the background of judges. For instance, Chief Justice Dixon, he was a survivor of being a soldier in the Second World War. He lost a leg. He saw the horrors that hate speech and genocide and racism cause. And you can see that in his decisions like Keekstra, in terms of upholding Canadian hate speech prohibitions, criminal hate speech prohibitions. So I think it's incredibly important that judges not only understand the legal arguments in the abstract, but they also have some personal experience to draw upon. How do things play out in the real world? What are the real world implications of the issue that's in question there? I think that's incredibly important. It's also a matter of merit.
Naomi Metallic is a lawyer and a Chancellor's Chair in Aboriginal Law and Policy at Dalhousie University. She is from the Listigouche Mi'kmaq First Nation in Quebec.
I think representation is super important because you know, having people in the room who have different experiences and different ideas, I also think that just kind of makes other people in the room actually think about their experiences. There's also the role that they might have in persuading others, but even your presence sometimes in a room makes people more inclined to think about your communities and the issues of your communities. And, you know, people can also play an educative function.
You know, the condition that the interests of justice be respected. That's the condition imposed in both Supreme Court decisions for a reason, and that is to prevent that abuse that you're speaking about.
Court advocates say diversity in the court is a balancing act while ensuring the most qualified judge is not overlooked. And though more diverse representation on the court is important, it may not address issues for interested groups.
I would be cautious to say that I don't think it's the full answer, because not all women see feminism the way some of us do. That doesn't mean I'm right and they're wrong. It's just that there's not a synchronicity of ideas between representatives in a group. Not all Black judges will see issues of race discrimination in the same way. You can see that on the U.S. Supreme Court. Not all Indigenous judges will see law in the same way.
And I'm really very proud of the fact that our Supreme Court has sort of led the way in diversity in appointments with respect to women and minorities, although it's certainly far from representing all minorities in this very complex country we call Canada.
Increasing diversity on the Supreme Court, in addition to regional representation, bigurial and bilingual judges will shape the court and its decisions. To come, a look at some of the landmark decisions that have shaped Canada.
For me, the Supreme Court is the place where the most disadvantaged and the most unpopular can seek justice. And it played that role before the Charter and plays that role after the Charter. Before the Charter, I think the Supreme Court's finest moments were in the 1950s, where in a series of cases, it stood up to the religious authoritarianism of the Duplessis regime in Quebec.
You know, it's hard to really articulate the kind of sea change that Morgentaler represented in terms of recognizing abortion rights and reproductive rights for Canadians.
From the court's creation in 1875 to present-day key rulings from the bench, CPAC's Inside the Supreme Court of Canada, 150 years of the highest court in the land.